Triple H is facing a problem WWE never expected. Raw is struggling to fill arenas. Ticket sales are slipping, and some now believe it's becoming more profitable to cancel certain shows than to open the doors. The surprising part is that much of it can be traced back to one decision. Let me break it down. Let's start with the number that changes everything: 525 million hours. That is how much WWE content Netflix subscribers consumed in 2025 alone, the first full calendar year of the partnership. Raw by itself accounted for 340 million of those hours. That's not a show struggling for attention. That's a cultural force, or at least the financial shell of one. The premiere episode, January 6, 2025, drew 4.9 million global views in its first 7 days, a 116% increase over what Raw had been doing on cable the year before. Netflix dropped it into living rooms in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and Latin America all at once. Raw had never been that globally distributed, that easily accessible, or that aggressively marketed in its entire 30-year history. And within weeks, it started to slide. By January 13, viewership had already cooled to 3.7 million. By February, it was settling into a weekly range somewhere between 2.6 and 3.1 million. By September, it had hit its lowest point since the debut, just 2.3 million global views in the week of September 22, with only 4.5 million total hours watched across 7 days. The show that had exploded onto Netflix was already behaving like a show in decline. Just 9 months into the deal that was supposed to save it, the drop on its own isn't unusual. Premiere weeks always inflate numbers. Curiosity always creates a spike, but the shape of Raw's decline on Netflix tells a story beyond just natural cooling. Because while those numbers were falling, the financial infrastructure around the show was getting stronger. TKO's second quarter results for 2025 showed net income of $273 million, a jump of $226 million from the same quarter the year before. WWE's specific revenue segment grew to $556 million in just 3 months. The machine was printing money at a rate that required almost no improvement in the actual show. That is the central tension at the heart of everything that follows. Triple H has built or inherited or benefited from an enterprise where the show's quality is almost entirely decoupled from its financial performance. The Netflix deal guarantees the revenue regardless of week-to-week numbers. The live event gates keep breaking records, whether the television product is compelling or not. The TKO quarterly filings confirm what insiders have been whispering for years. The money is locked in. The storytelling doesn't have to be. And when the money is already signed, the man running creative doesn't face the same pressure that once kept this industry honest. Vince McMahon, for all his documented faults, ran a product where every quarter had to justify itself, where ratings directly impacted negotiating leverage, where you had to be good to stay financially viable. That equation no longer applies, and Triple H, whether intentionally or not, is the beneficiary and the prisoner of that new reality. Paul Levesque formally took over as WWE's Chief Content Officer in 2022. It was one of the most anticipated transitions in wrestling history. Fans who had grown exhausted and worse with Vince McMahon's final years welcomed the change with something approaching euphoria. Triple H's track record at NXT had been legitimately impressive. That brand under his watch had become an underground phenomenon, a critically praised wrestling product that rewarded patience, long-form storytelling, and athletic credibility over spectacle. The promise was simple: bring NXT's DNA to the main roster, clean up the mess, build new stars, trust the audience. And for a while, specifically the run that culminated in WrestleMania 40, it genuinely seemed like it was working. Cody Rhodes completing his story, the bloodline at peak cultural relevance. CM Punk back and generating the kind of combustible energy the main roster hadn't felt in years. That 2024 window looked like the beginning of something lasting. It was, in retrospect, the peak. Because since that moment, the Triple H era has entered a phase that nobody in 2022 predicted. one where the show generates more money than ever while creative direction has grown more cautious, more repetitive, and more reliant on protected finishes, safe storytelling, and a roster full of stars over 40 years old, who are being asked to carry a show that was supposed to be building its future. Roman Reigns shifted to a part-time schedule. Seth Rollins got hurt. CM Punk, who had become, as one analysis put it, Raw's only reliable star, is a 47-year-old man who has been carrying a flagship show that should have younger headliners by now. The structure was always going to strain under that weight. The question was when and by how much. Here's what makes the financial picture so important to understand before we go deeper into the creative failure. TKO Group's full year 2025 guidance was raised multiple times during the year, eventually targeting revenue of between $4.69 and $4.72 billion, with adjusted EBITDA between $1.57 and $1.58 billion. Those are numbers that speak to extraordinary health, the kind of numbers that make executives comfortable, that satisfy shareholders, that win praise on earnings calls. And they're also the numbers that make it almost impossible to argue internally that something is wrong. Because when your boss is looking at quarterly filings that show a 75% jump in adjusted EBITDA and record performance at WWE, what exactly is the crisis? What is the fire that needs to be put out? From 30,000 feet, this company has never been healthier. The man running Raw gets to look at those numbers and nod. The people actually watching the show every week know something different. Jonathan Coachman said it plainly, speaking on the Coach and Bro show in early 2026. He was talking about the internal dynamics visible on WWE Unreal, the documentary series that gave fans an unprecedented look behind the curtain. But the frustration he expressed cut to the core of the whole debate. He said he was tired of every conversation about quality being answered with a reference to how much money the company makes. That the storylines not being there doesn't matter because the money is already signed. That is the clearest articulation of the structural problem anyone has offered publicly. The money being guaranteed has severed the feedback loop that once forced creative accountability, and Triple H sits at the center of that feedback loop. He decides what goes on Raw. He decides how matches end, which stars get built, which angles get green-lit, and which shows rise or fall on the strength of their ideas. He is, as he has made clear, the man through whom all decisions flow. When the product is good, that credit belongs to him. When it isn't, and by the end of 2025 even his defenders were acknowledging it wasn't, that's his too. What fans saw in 2025 was a Raw that had found its Netflix home, but lost something harder to quantify. The show that once felt like it was building towards something had started to feel like it was simply happening. Episodes arriving, content filling the runtime, feuds extending by the week through disqualification finishes and run-in brawls, promos that set up more promos, title reigns that didn't go anywhere decisive. The show wasn't bad enough to alienate anyone immediately, but it was hollow in a way that accumulated over weeks and months into something that felt very much like a slow bleed. The viewership numbers tracked that hollowness faithfully. The show averaged 2.9 million global viewers weekly across the year, a number that Netflix was comfortable reporting publicly and that WWE was happy to cite in press materials. But strip away the premiere episode, the special events, and the weeks where a major angle drove temporary curiosity, and you find a product that had settled comfortably below where it opened, with no obvious creative catalyst on the horizon capable of reversing that drift. There's a phrase that analysts and critics started using to describe Raw in this period: appointment television that had forgotten why people made the appointment. The Netflix platform made the show easier to access than ever. You didn't need to be home on Monday night. You didn't need cable. You could watch on any screen anytime. But the platform's flexibility became a mirror for the show's lack of urgency. If nothing on Raw demanded you watch it live, if the narrative stakes weren't high enough to create that pull, then the on-demand nature of streaming became a way of acknowledging that nothing had been lost by waiting or by skipping, That quiet erosion, not a collapse, not a crisis, just a steady ambient draining of genuine investment, is what Triple H is now managing. Not a fire, a slow pressure leak. The kind that doesn't trigger alarms until one day the tank is empty. The irony is suffocating. Raw is generating more revenue per episode than it ever did on cable. It's reaching a global audience it never could have touched on USA Network. It's part of a media company that is growing, expanding, and making its investors very happy. And the show at the center of all of it. The show that built WWE's identity over 30 years. The show that gave the world the Monday Night Wars, the Attitude Era, the Ruthless Aggression Era. The transformation of pro wrestling into mainstream entertainment has become so financially stable that no one with the power to change it has any structural incentive to do so. That's the machine. That's what Triple H is running. And now we have to talk about what's happening inside it. The first thing you need to understand about Triple H's creative era is how much it raised expectations. When Paul Levesque took over the booking chair from Vince McMahon in 2022, he wasn't walking into a neutral environment. He was walking into one of the most charged creative moments in WWE history. Fans had spent years voicing frustration with McMahon's approach, the repetitive structures, the last-minute rewrites, the sense that storylines were being made up on the fly, with no regard for consistency or long-term payoff. Levesque represented the explicit opposite of all of that. His NXT era had been built on the principles McMahon's main roster had abandoned: consistency, character development, athletic credibility, and crucially, respect for the audience's intelligence. The NXT fans believed they were watching a product that was being curated for them, not simply generated at them. That distinction mattered enormously. It created loyalty of a kind the main roster hadn't felt in years. So when Triple H took over Raw and SmackDown, the goodwill he brought into the room was extraordinary. And for a stretch of 2023 and into 2024, he used it well. The Bloodline story was the centerpiece of everything that worked in this era. It was long-form, layered, emotionally resonant, and built to a proper crescendo. Roman Reigns had been champion for years. The story of Cody Rhodes pursuing the title had been constructed with patience and payoff. And WrestleMania 40 delivered on almost every promise the booking had made. It was the kind of wrestling that reminded people why they fell in love with the medium, consequences that felt real, characters whose motivations made internal sense, and a crowd that was fully, genuinely invested. The problem is that it was also a high watermark that the creative team has not come close to replicating in the months since. The post-WrestleMania 40 period exposed something about the Triple H creative model that the previous 2 years had concealed. It was better at building to something than sustaining what came after. Once the Cody Roman chapter closed, there was no obvious next chapter of equal scale waiting in the wings. The storyline architecture that had carried the show through that long build suddenly had to generate something new, and the cupboard was less full than anyone had admitted. Jey Uso got a push as a solo star and moved merchandise at an impressive rate, but the attempt to position him as the next top face never quite clicked at a main event level. Seth Rollins tried to claim main character status on Raw and then got injured twice. CM Punk, whose return had been one of the most electric moments of recent memory, was a 47-year-old man being asked to anchor a weekly show that had no obvious next generation ready to take the weight off him. The star-making machine that NXT was supposed to feed into the main roster wasn't producing names with the kind of immediate cultural traction that the story needed. One analysis from late 2025 put it with clinical precision. Most of the top names in WWE at that point were over 40 years old, and the biggest angle of the year was a John Cena retirement tour that ended by putting over an already established heel in Gunther. That detail, the retirement tour climaxing with a result that didn't create a new star, became a kind of symbol for the era's creative limitations. The road was built beautifully. The destination was safe. The safe instinct runs through nearly everything Triple H's team has produced since that 2024 peak. Match finishes on Raw became notorious for avoiding commitment. DQ endings, run-in interruptions, 50-50 booking that protected everyone from losing while preventing anyone from truly winning. As the Sportster's analysis noted, Triple H had become far too reliant on disqualifications or distractions, looking for results that protected talent rather than building them. The weekly product became predictable in a way that compounded over time. When nothing on Raw feels decisive, nothing on Raw feels important. The internal mechanics of how the show gets made have added another layer of concern. Dave Meltzer, speaking on Wrestling Observer Radio, described a pattern that was generating real frustration inside WWE, plans being made and then changed, WrestleMania directions being set and then reversed, the whole operation operating with a level of instability that was drawing comparisons to the final years of Vince McMahon's reign. The specifics of what was getting changed and why weren't always clear publicly, but the through line was recognizable. An organization whose head of creative was making it up as he went, in ways that were costing people preparation time and narrative coherence. That comparison to McMahon lands with particular weight because removing that instability was supposed to be one of Triple H's core improvements. He was the antidote to the chaotic last-minute rewrites, the plan changes, the creative dysfunction. And yet here is Meltzer describing the exact same pattern playing out again, with Levesque's name in the chair instead of his father-in-law's. The WWE Unreal documentary series, a behind-the-scenes production that gave fans access to the creative process in an unprecedented way, turned out to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it humanized the production and showed the enormous logistical complexity of putting a weekly show of this scale together. On the other hand, it exposed disagreements within the creative team that weren't flattering. Jonathan Coachman's public reaction to what he saw in the show was telling. He described the creative team as appearing out of touch and noted that internal friction over booking decisions, over talent pushes, over how titles were being managed, was directly affecting the product on screen. Specific examples surfaced. Disagreements over the Gunther versus Pat McAfee booking at Backlash 2025. Creative team member Michael Hayes expressing skepticism about Chelsea Green's ceiling. Triple H himself reportedly being resistant to giving Green a second United States Championship run despite other voices in the room pushing for it. These are small details in isolation. In aggregate, they suggest a creative culture where certain decisions calcify around the preferences of the person at the top, and where the talent and storylines that don't fit that preference simply get left to wither. The women's division became the most visible symptom of this dynamic. WWE's women's roster in this era has been described, without much argument, as the most talented collection of female performers in the history of the company. The in-ring quality is extraordinary. The roster depth is real, and yet the booking has repeatedly failed them. Rhea Ripley and Becky Lynch, names that once carried main event energy, drifted into secondary status as the show's center of gravity stayed locked on the Men's World Championship picture. Tiffany Stratton and Stephanie Vaquer were positioned as the new top names in the division, but regularly struggled for meaningful TV time and match allocation. The Evolution pay-per-view made a return in 2025 and delivered what many considered WWE's best single event of the year. All-female card, outstanding performances, a crowd that was genuinely excited to see this tier of talent get its own stage. And then WWE did almost nothing with the momentum. The main event of that show, a match between Naomi, Rhea Ripley, and Io Sky, was given the opening slot at SummerSlam rather than being positioned as a headlining statement. The message, intentional or not, was clear. The women's product is something WWE promotes when it needs to and deprioritizes when something else is on the schedule. The mid-card title picture on Raw told a similar story. The US title, both the men's and women's versions, became emblematic of a creative environment that creates titles without creating the storytelling infrastructure to make those titles mean anything. Frequent championship changes between Chelsea Green, Zelina Vega, and Julia prevented any single reign from developing weight. Men's champions like Ilya Dragunov and Sami Zayn had the in-ring capability to make something memorable, but weren't given the high-stakes feuds that would have elevated what they were doing into something the audience genuinely cared about. Title changes became administrative rather than climactic. They happened. They didn't matter. What makes the mid-card failure especially painful is that it was supposed to be one of Triple H's signature improvements. One of the most repeated criticisms of the McMahon era was that it was impossible for anyone who wasn't in the main event picture to get over, because the mid-card was booked as a holding zone rather than a launching pad. Triple H was going to fix that. He'd done it at NXT, where mid-card titles built careers and feuds in the mid-card produced genuine stars. On the main roster, the same discipline has not held. The mid-card on Raw is still a holding zone. The titles just have new names. The structural picture that emerges from all of this is one that Bleacher Report's analysis captured with blunt clarity at the end of 2025. The Triple H era reached its creative zenith in 2024, and signs point more to a creative fall than a rise into 2026. That's not a fringe take from a disgruntled corner of the internet. That's a mainstream wrestling outlet doing a year-end accounting of the era and arriving at a conclusion that Triple H's best work is behind him, and that nothing in the current pipeline suggests a reversal is coming. The reasons for that conclusion are layered. They involve the star-making failure, the safe booking instinct, the women's division mismanagement, the mid-card neglect, the internal creative friction, and the lack of a rising generation ready to carry the show into its next chapter. They also involve something harder to fix through any individual booking decision, the structural incentive problem that the Netflix money created. When the business is this healthy regardless of what the show does creatively, the pressure that once forced innovation simply isn't there. And Triple H, brilliant as his NXT era was, earnest as his creative intentions might be, is operating inside a machine that doesn't need him to be great, just good enough. And good enough has a way of becoming not quite enough before anyone is ready to admit it. What the Bleacher Report analysis identified and what the weekly ratings confirmed in their quiet, relentless way was a product entering a drift phase, not a collapse. Not a death, a drift. The kind where each individual week is forgivable in isolation, where each decision can be explained with logic, where the big picture is always supposedly being managed, but where the cumulative effect, week over week and month over month, is a show that is consistently a little less interesting than it could be, a little less committed, a little less sharp. Dave Meltzer's reporting on the internal plan changes. The attendance advance being down, heading into some events. The feeling of everything being up in the air. These aren't catastrophic signals, but they are signals. And in an industry where the audience's emotional investment is the only truly irreplaceable asset, a drift phase is not a stable phase. It's a phase that either gets interrupted by something that re-engages people, or it continues until the audience hasn't left exactly, but has simply stopped caring with the same intensity. The people who run Raw can look at the Netflix numbers and tell themselves the audience is still there. They are. But there's a difference between an audience that is present and an audience that is locked in. Raw right now has the former. What it's losing, slowly and persistently, is the latter. Here's a number that should keep anyone in WWE's creative department up at night. By the end of 2025, most of WWE's top headlining names were over 40 years old. 40. In a performance-based athletic entertainment product that has always depended, at some level, on the electricity of someone new breaking through. Someone the audience doesn't have a predetermined relationship with, someone who creates genuine surprise. The show's main event picture had calcified around a group of people whose careers, by any honest reckoning, were closer to their end than their beginning. Roman Reigns, still the biggest name in the company's recent history, had moved to a part-time schedule so irregular that WWE Creative couldn't build around him with any reliability. CM Punk, whose 2023 return had been one of the most emotionally charged moments in the product's recent history, was carrying Raw as its anchor star at 47 years old. Seth Rollins had gotten hurt multiple times, missing significant chunks of programming at moments when the show needed him most. AJ Styles retired from in-ring competition at the Royal Rumble in early 2026. Cody Rhodes, Brock Lesnar, these were names that were themselves reportedly looking at the horizon, aware that the window for big match moments was narrowing. The question this creates for Triple H is the most fundamental one in wrestling. Who comes next? Who are the names that in 3 years, 5 years are carrying this show? Who are the Cody Rhodeses of the next generation, the homegrown stories in development that audiences are going to invest in the way they invested in the Bloodline saga? The answer, as of 2026, is alarmingly thin. One analysis concluded that if not for Seth Rollins' injury creating a forced opening, Bron Breakker's own breakout would still be on standby, and described him as the only obvious under-30 star ready to break into the main event in 2026. One name in a roster of hundreds, 120-something with main event readiness. That is a damning indictment of the star-making infrastructure, not just of Triple H's booking era, but of the broader talent development pipeline that his NXT was supposed to be feeding. The irony cuts deep here because NXT under Triple H's leadership was supposed to be the solution to exactly this problem. The black and gold era of NXT produced a remarkable roster. Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, Finn Balor, Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, Bayley, the list goes on. These are names that became major contributors to the main roster, some of whom are still running main events today. But that pipeline, which flourished in the mid-2010s, has not produced an equivalent wave since. Part of that is timing. The NXT that Levesque ran before taking over the main roster eventually shifted in format, became more of a traditional developmental brand, and lost some of the curatorial magic that made the black and gold era special. By the time he was running Raw and SmackDown, his direct attention to NXT had diminished. The talent development infrastructure that he'd built and maintained was now operating somewhat on its own, and the names coming out of it weren't arriving on the main roster with the same immediate readiness. But there's a more uncomfortable version of this conversation that needs to be had. And it's this: Triple H's booking on the main roster, specifically on Raw, has not been building new stars as effectively as the roster's talent level should allow. This is distinct from the NXT pipeline question. This is about what happens to talent once they arrive on the flagship show. The roster in the Triple H era has been described repeatedly as one of WWE's greatest ever in terms of sheer athletic depth and versatility. The names are there. The ability is there. The characters, in many cases, are there. What hasn't been there, consistently, repeatedly, is the booking commitment to actually take those people to the next level. LA Knight is the example that comes up most often. By early 2025, Knight had reached what every metric of fan engagement describes as white-hot status. Crowd reactions, merchandise, social media, every indicator said this person is ready to be a main event champion. Triple H's team saw it, the audience was screaming it, and the decision, reportedly, was to hold off, to play the long game, to let it develop. What actually happened was that the momentum cooled, the white-hot intensity became merely warm, and Knight spent the latter part of 2025 in what one analysis called limbo feuds, against opponents who weren't elevating him or being elevated by him. The moment passed, the audience moved on. Drew McIntyre's heel run in 2025 went through something similar. His character work as the Scottish Warrior heel was widely praised as one of the most compelling villain performances the company had produced in years. Audiences were fully engaged. Critics were citing it as one of the best things happening on WWE TV. And again, the booking decision was patience. The right moment was always just around the corner. The title win that would have crystallized the character's ascent kept getting deferred in favor of setups, extensions, and storyline threads that maintained the status quo rather than pulling the trigger. The pattern here is not an accident. It's a philosophy. Triple H's creative instinct, shaped by years of long-form NXT storytelling, is to build slowly, protect carefully, and avoid short-term moves that might compromise long-term architecture. That instinct served him well when he had the time and structure of NXT to execute it in. On a weekly flagship show generating content at industrial scale, with a roster of aging stars whose windows are closing, that same instinct has become a liability. Sometimes the moment to push the button is now, and now doesn't come back. The women's division tells the star-making failure story with particular clarity because the raw material, the talent on the roster, makes the failure harder to excuse. Bianca Belair, Rhea Ripley, Io Sky, Bayley, Becky Lynch, Tiffany Stratton, Jade Cargill, Julia, Stephanie Vaquer. This is a generation of women's wrestling talent that a different creative environment would be producing sustained mainstream breakout moments with regularly. Instead, the booking has kept most of them cycling through mid-card adjacent feuds, title reigns that don't build to anything emotionally significant, and TV time allocations that suggest the show's central gravity is always somewhere else. The Women's US Championship became a running joke among engaged fans, a belt that changed hands frequently between Chelsea Green, Zelina Vega, and Julia, without any of those reigns generating storylines that made fans care about the title as an object of value. Becky Lynch's Women's Intercontinental Championship reign of 163 days was a bright spot, a long enough run to establish real momentum. But even that, in the broader context of how the division was being booked, felt like an isolated success rather than a sign of systemic improvement. The male mid-card faced the same ceiling. Ilja Dragunov arrived on Raw with credentials that should have made him a fast-rising star on the main event ladder. Technically brilliant, physically compelling, with a character intensity that translated immediately to live crowds. The booking used him in ways that were fine, matches that were good, feuds that were coherent, but never gave him the high-stakes narrative he needed to break into the next tier. Sami Zayn, one of the most consistently overperformers in the company, spent stretches of 2025 in storylines that felt like placeholder content rather than meaningful development. The talent was there. The booking machinery to convert that talent into genuine, lasting overness simply wasn't being applied. This is the paradox that defines the mid-Triple H era more than any single booking decision. A roster that is arguably the most athletically gifted in WWE history, being managed by a creative team that is consistently producing results that don't match that potential. Not because the matches are bad. The in-ring product is genuinely excellent across almost every level of the card, but because great matches without great stakes are exhibition bouts, not wrestling television. And exhibition bouts don't create stars. They just fill time. The aging headliner problem and the star-making failure are not separate issues. They're the same issue viewed from different angles. If the Star Factory were working, if Raw were consistently creating the LA Knights and Braun Breakers and Julius of tomorrow at the rate the talent pipeline allows, then the aging of the current headliners would be a natural transition rather than a crisis. Every era ends. The Attitude Era ended. The Ruthless Aggression Era ended. The Cena Era ended. They ended because the next generation was being built simultaneously, so that when the handoff came, the audience had already started to care about the next group. That handoff is not being prepared with the urgency it requires. The people who should be the next generation of Raw's headliners in 2027 and 2028 are currently in limbo feuds, mid-card holding patterns, and title programs that don't have the resources to make them feel important. When Cody Rhodes eventually takes his final curtain call, and that day is closer than WWE's creative planning seems to acknowledge, the show needs someone ready. Right now, the someone ready list is very short. Braun Breaker is the closest thing to a genuine exception. His breakout, forced by Rollins' injury, arrived with convincing force. The crowd responded, the push had momentum. But as the analysis noted, that push was contingent on an injury. It wasn't planned and executed as a deliberate star-making campaign. It happened to him rather than being done for him. That distinction matters because it reveals that the system wasn't positioned to develop him on its own timeline. It took someone else getting hurt to create the opening. When the next generation of stars depends on circumstance rather than plan, the plan isn't working. Gunther's rise is a more organic success story from the Triple H era, a long dominant championship reign built around a character whose menace and in-ring credibility made every defense feel consequential. But Gunther is 37, and his peak has coincided with the vacancy left by other names fading. He's the kind of performer who makes his era look good, without necessarily being the one creating the infrastructure for the next era. He fills the present. He doesn't solve the future. What all of this adds up to? The aging roster, the stalled mid-card, the failed star-making attempts, the booking conservatism is a show that is coasting on inherited equity while quietly depleting the reserves that equity was built on. Every time a guaranteed headliner like Roman Reigns misses weeks because of his part-time schedule, there's a deficit. Every time a hot act like LA Knight gets cooled down by indecisive booking, there's a deficit. Every time the women's division gets sidelined after a moment that should have been built upon, there's a deficit. These deficits don't show up in TKO's quarterly filings. They show up in the quiet erosion of the audience's sense. That Raw is a show where things are happening that genuinely matter. And by late 2025, the people paying closest attention had noticed. Not just the online community, which has always had a critical constituency, but mainstream wrestling coverage, industry analysts, and the internal voices that Coachman was describing publicly. The concern was real. The product had a problem, and the person with the power to fix it, or more precisely, to admit that there was something to fix, was still telling anyone who asked that the show was thriving, because the numbers said so. And the numbers in that context were doing everyone a disservice. The Netflix deal was announced in January 2024 with a kind of fanfare that surrounds genuinely historic moments. Raw was leaving cable television, a platform it had occupied since 1993, and moving to the world's largest streaming service. The financial terms weren't publicly disclosed in complete detail, but the structure was reported as a rights fee arrangement, where WWE received guaranteed money from Netflix in exchange for exclusivity. The deal covered the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and Latin America. Raw would launch on the platform in January 2025. The wrestling industry treated this as an unambiguous victory, and in purely financial terms, it was. The cable TV ecosystem that had once made Raw's weekly ratings a genuine business barometer was contracting. Cord cutting was accelerating. The idea of a deal with a 300 million-plus subscriber global streaming platform with guaranteed revenue baked into the contract was exactly the kind of move that protects a major content brand from the uncertainty of the traditional TV model. WWE had positioned itself ahead of the curve. Nick Khan and the TKO team deserved credit for it. But the deal also imported a set of complications that have shaped Raw's first year on Netflix in ways that weren't fully anticipated. The most visible one was advertising. Raw on Netflix was not an ad-free streaming experience. The show ran with advertisements, substantial ones, which became one of the most consistent complaints from viewers almost immediately after the January 6 premiere. By the time 2025 was wrapping up, WWE had received enough internal and external feedback about the ad load that they announced a reduction heading into 2026. The show was generating so many ad minutes that it was disrupting the viewing experience in ways that the old cable model, paradoxically, had been better calibrated to manage. The reduction announcement was welcome. It was also a signal that the first year on Netflix had been something of a calibration exercise, a period of learning what works on a platform that operates on fundamentally different principles than the cable television Raw had spent 3 decades on. The measurement shift was the other major complication, and it's one that the fan community and media have spent considerable energy trying to understand. For 30 years, Raw's health was measured in something concrete and comparable: Nielsen ratings. A number came out every Tuesday morning, and you knew exactly where you stood. 3.0 is good. 2.0 is concerning. The audience either watched or it didn't, and the number told you which. Netflix doesn't measure that way. The platform reports views, defined as a household engaging with a title for a certain threshold of time, and it reports hours viewed. These numbers are global, aggregated across all time zones and viewing contexts, and they're not directly comparable to the Nielsen ratings that define Raw's historical identity. When Netflix says Raw averaged over 3 million viewers per week in 2025, that means something. But it doesn't mean the same thing as 3 million households watching at 8 p.m. on Monday. It includes on-demand viewing, catch-up viewing, people watching in Mexico City and London and Sao Paulo. The number is real, what it represents is different. That difference has created an unusual dynamic for Triple H's creative team. The feedback mechanism that once provided the clearest, most immediate signal of whether the audience was engaged, the Tuesday morning rating, no longer exists in its traditional form. Netflix's top 10 charts give a weekly ranking, but a show ranking 5th in the global top 10, and a show ranking 9th carry very different implications for an audience, accustomed to thinking in terms of raw numbers rather than relative positions. The granular, episode-specific accountability that the Nielsen era enforced, where a bad show could drop your number measurably the following week, has been replaced by a broader, slower-moving indicator that is harder to act on in real time. For a creative team that is already inclined toward conservative, long-term thinking, this slower feedback loop may be the single most dangerous structural condition surrounding the show right now. If the mechanism that once told you quickly when something wasn't working has been replaced with one that takes weeks to generate legible data, and if that data is global and aggregated rather than domestic and specific, the signal-to-noise ratio for creative decision-making degrades. Bad storylines don't punish themselves as quickly. Good ones don't reward themselves as visibly. The whole system becomes less corrective. There's a second Netflix complication that doesn't get discussed enough, and it's about content positioning. When Raw was on USA Network, it was the singular event in WWE's cable TV week. One 3-hour block every Monday, the show existed in a context of scarcity. You watched it or you missed it. On Netflix, Raw shares a content library with thousands of other titles, competing for the same attention, on the same platform, in the same recommendation algorithm. The show isn't competing just against AEW Dynamite or whatever else is on Monday night. It's competing against every other piece of content on a platform with 300 million subscribers and decades of prestige television. That context changes the audience psychology in ways that are difficult to quantify but deeply real. When you watch Raw on Netflix, the click to put something else on is the same click you used to get to Raw in the first place. The barrier to exit is identical to the barrier to entry. On cable, inertia kept viewers in place. You watched Raw and left it on because the alternative was actively switching. On Netflix, the algorithm is continuously offering you the next thing. The friction of walking away has been reduced to zero. In that environment, keeping a viewer locked in for 3 hours requires a level of ongoing narrative urgency that the current Raw product, by any honest assessment, has not consistently maintained. The ad controversy from Raw's first year on Netflix pointed to something deeper than just a preference for fewer commercials. It pointed to a disconnect between what Netflix viewers expect, clean, professionally paced streaming content with controlled advertising, and what Raw, as a product built for cable TV, was actually delivering. The show was a cable TV product in a streaming container. The seams showed, not always, not catastrophically, but enough that viewers noticed, enough that complaints accumulated, and enough that WWE's own response, reducing ads heading into 2026, was an implicit acknowledgement that the transition had not been as seamless as the headline numbers suggested. The deeper question that acknowledgement raises is whether Raw as a format, 3 hours weekly with the pacing rhythms and content structures of a cable wrestling show, is the right product for the Netflix platform at all. Netflix's most successful original content tends to be structured differently. Serialized narrative arcs, episodes of manageable length, stories with clear beginnings and ends. Raw is episodic in the loosest sense. It has a continuous narrative, but it doesn't have the kind of clean episode architecture that streaming audiences have been trained to expect. It's more like a live sports broadcast than a streaming series, and the question of whether that format, at 3 hours of weekly length, sustains the attention of an audience that chose streaming over cable for reasons that include the ability to consume content on their own terms, is one that nobody inside WWE has been willing to publicly engage with directly. Triple H has spoken about the flexibility of Raw's runtime on Netflix. The show isn't constrained to a fixed TV slot, which means it can run however long the creative content dictates. That's a genuine advantage in theory. But in practice, Raw's runtime on Netflix has not trended toward becoming a leaner, more purposefully structured product. It has remained at the approximate length of its cable era, with the same general format: opening segment, multiple matches, mid-show angles, main event, that it had when it was filling a 3-hour USA Network window. The freedom Netflix offered hasn't been used to reimagine the show's structure. It's been used to maintain the same structure in a new container. That conservatism, applying a cable TV production philosophy to a streaming platform, is another dimension of the broader creative conservatism that has defined the Triple H era's second phase. The same instinct that produces protected finishes and deferred star-making pushes is producing a show that doesn't look like it was designed for the platform it's on. It looks like a show that was moved to a new platform and asked to keep doing what it had always done. Netflix asked for Raw. WWE delivered cable television with a different distribution method. The Raw viewership trajectory over the course of 2025 from 4.9 million at debut to the 2.63.1 million range through the middle of the year to the September low of 2.3 million, and the stabilization at around 2.5 million toward year's end tells the story of a show that generated enormous curiosity at launch and then settled into a consistent but unspectacular performance plateau. For Netflix, as a business, that plateau may be entirely acceptable. Raw in the global top 10 for 47 of 52 weeks is a success story by any streaming platform's metrics. The deal is working for Netflix, for WWE's creative ambitions, and for the question of what kind of show Raw wants to be in its next decade. The plateau is more problematic, because a show that generates its best numbers in the week it debuts and then spends the rest of the year returning to a lower baseline is not a show that is building audience. It's a show that is retaining a portion of the audience that already existed, plus the new global viewers that the platform opened up. That's not negligible, but it's also not growth. And for a product being marketed as the future of WWE, growth is what the promise requires. The Netflix deal also brought with it a set of marketing and cross-promotional expectations that have shaped Raw's content in visible ways. The Stranger Things crossover episode in January 2026, the appearances at Netflix events, the integration with Netflix's broader promotional machinery. These are legitimate benefits of the partnership. They expand Raw's cultural footprint. They put WWE talent in front of audiences who would never have sought out wrestling on cable. The grand openings of Netflix houses, the Toodum events, the NFL Christmas Day integration. WWE has been a visible and active Netflix partner in all of the ways the deal intended. But those integrations also create content pressures that exist independently of what's best for wrestling storytelling. When a Raw episode is shaped in part by a Netflix cross-promotional priority, when celebrity appearances, pop culture tie-ins, and platform marketing events become part of the show's content planning, the creative team has less freedom to simply make the best wrestling show they can. The show becomes a multi-purpose content event, serving multiple masters simultaneously. That's not necessarily fatal to quality, but it adds complexity to an already complicated production, and it introduces non-wrestling priorities into a content space where wrestling priorities should come first. Let's talk about where all of this lands, because the story of Triple H and Raw in 2025 and heading into 2026 is not a simple one. It's not the story of a failure. It's not the story of a man who destroyed something. It's more complicated than that. And more interesting, it's the story of a man who is genuinely good at his job, being placed inside a structure that has, in important ways, made the consequences of being merely adequate disappear. And when the consequences disappear, the incentive to be great disappears with them. The financial picture is extraordinary. TKO's full year 2026 guidance targets revenue of $5.67 to $5.775 billion, with adjusted EBITDA of $2.24 to $2.29 billion. Those are numbers that represent the most commercially successful period in the company's history, and they're continuing to grow. The quarterly filings show WWE's segment contributing meaningfully to that growth every single period. The Netflix deal is performing. The live event gates are strong. Premium live event attendance and revenue continue to set records. The shareholders are happy. The board is happy. Ari Emanuel's earnings call language about record performance is not spin. It's accurate. None of that is Triple H's failure. It's his success in the most legible corporate sense. The problem is the divergence between that financial health and the creative health of the actual show. And that divergence, which has been building since the post-WrestleMania 40 period, has now been documented not just by online critics and wrestling nerds, but by mainstream wrestling coverage, by Bleacher Report, by The Sportster, by industry analyst outlets, and by internal figures, speaking publicly about the creative dysfunction they've observed. The conversation has moved from, is the product declining, to how do we understand why it's declining despite the company being this successful. Jonathan Coachman's observation is the most cutting summary of that divergence available. The money being already signed changes everything about how creative accountability functions. When the Netflix deal delivers guaranteed revenue regardless of episode quality, when premium live events sell out on the basis of the brand rather than any specific card, when TKO's quarterly numbers trend upward regardless of whether last week's Raw was compelling, the pressure valve that once enforced quality has been removed. And without that pressure valve, the creative team is operating in an environment where being better isn't necessary to survive, it's just optional. That optionality is what makes the Triple H era's second phase so interesting from a structural standpoint, because Levesque is not a man without ambition or creative conviction. He demonstrated real quality in his NXT years and in the early main roster period. He cares about the product, at least the evidence suggests he does. But caring about quality in an environment that doesn't penalize mediocrity requires a different kind of internal discipline. The kind that doesn't respond to external pressure because there isn't any. The kind that demands of itself more than the circumstances require. That kind of discipline is rare in any organization. In one where the quarterly numbers are spectacular, it's even rarer. Dave Meltzer's observation about the WrestleMania plans changing, the attendance advance being down for some events, the internal frustration with the instability of creative direction. These suggest that even within the creative team, the drift is being felt. The people inside the machine know something is off. The plans keep changing, not because the changes are improving things, but because the original plans weren't working and nobody is sure what will. That's a creative environment that is reacting rather than leading, and a show that is being booked reactively at the scale and complexity of a weekly 3-hour global flagship generates exactly the kind of product that Raw has become, competent in its individual moments, without a clear direction pulling those moments towards something. The aging roster crisis sits at the center of the reckoning in a way that makes the timeline urgent, because the window to address it is not unlimited. Cody Rhodes, Roman Reigns, CM Punk, Becky Lynch, Seth Rollins. These are the names that have carried the Netflix era of Raw. Several of them are dealing with injuries, part-time schedules, or the natural proximity to their career's final chapter. The clock on this generation is running, and the next generation, with Braun Breaker as the most ready name, and a mid-card full of talented people who haven't been positioned to break through, is not yet ready to carry the show at the required level. The urgency of that math should be shaping every creative decision Triple H makes right now. The show needs new stars built and finished, not started and stalled, not developed at the pace of a developmental brand, but accelerated with the intensity that a flagship live show demands. The women's division needs storylines that run through premium live event, main events, not one-off special showcases followed by months of marginalization. The mid-card titles need championship programs that last long enough and mean enough to make the people holding them feel important. The booking needs to start committing to outcomes rather than perpetually protecting everyone from the consequences of losing. What's at stake is not just the creative quality of a weekly show. It's the institutional knowledge and muscle memory that makes WWE WWE. The reason the Netflix deal happened, the reason TKO could build a $5 billion revenue business around WWE, the reason live events sell out, and merchandise moves and global audiences tune in, all of it traces back to a product that, at its core, is stories about people that audiences care deeply about. Stories about whether the hero gets the title, whether the villain gets his, whether the person you've been invested in for years gets the moment that validates the journey. Those stories are what Raw runs on. They are the irreplaceable raw material. And the alarming thing about the creative picture that emerges from an honest accounting of 2025 into 2026 is that the story-making machine has slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The ingredients are there, the roster, the platform, the audience. The throughput is down. And when throughput is down on the most important production line in your business, the fix isn't always technical. Sometimes it's philosophical. Sometimes it requires the person at the top of the creative process to step back from what has become comfortable and ask a genuinely difficult question: is what I'm doing good enough? Not good enough to keep the numbers where they are. Not good enough to satisfy the quarterly filing. Good enough for the people who have been watching this show their whole lives and are sitting at home right now, week after week, waiting to feel the thing they fell in love with wrestling to feel. The answer to that question, if it's asked honestly right now, is no. Not quite. Not yet. And that not yet is both a condemnation and a door. Because the machinery to make Raw great again, to make it urgent, emotionally alive, star-building, and narratively ambitious is entirely available to Triple H. It's sitting right there in the roster he has, in the platform Netflix has provided, in the audiences in those arenas who want desperately to have something to shout about. The talent is there, the reach is there, the tools are there. What's been missing in this phase of the era is the decisive use of them, the willingness to push the button when the moment demands it rather than waiting for the perfect plan, the confidence to let someone lose decisively when building someone else's win matters more than keeping everyone protected, the creativity to use the Netflix platform for something that actually looks different from what Raw has always looked like, something leaner, bolder, more visually dynamic, more structurally inventive. These are not impossible asks. They're the asks that Triple H himself articulated when he took this job in 2022. The people watching closely have started to say publicly what they'd been thinking privately. The Bleacher Report piece, the Sportster's time to step aside argument, the Sportskeeda analysis of 2025's mistakes, Coachman's TV appearance, Meltzer's reporting. These aren't fringe reactions. They're a coordinated chorus of people who cover this business seriously, arriving at versions of the same conclusion. The Triple H era is at an inflection point, and the direction it goes from here is genuinely uncertain. And here's what makes that uncertainty interesting rather than just alarming. Inflection points are where the most important creative decisions happen. The eras that matter. The Attitude Era, the Ruthless Aggression Era, the PG transition, the post-McMahon reset, all began at moments when something had to change, because what existed wasn't sustaining itself anymore. The conditions for a genuine creative renewal on Raw are arguably more favorable right now than they've been since the Netflix launch. The platform is reaching an audience no cable deal could. The roster depth is real. The global appetite for WWE content, 525 million hours in 1 year, is not a fiction. These are real assets, sitting underneath a product that hasn't fully deployed them. The question is whether the man running the show is going to look at the divergence between what Raw is commercially and what Raw is creatively, and decide that the divergence is acceptable, or whether he's going to look at it and decide it isn't. Whether the comfort of the guaranteed money is going to be the ceiling of his ambition, or whether the same person who built NXT from a reality show cast-off into an underground phenomenon that changed professional wrestling's relationship with its audience is going to find that fire again and apply it to the biggest show in the world. Because that's ultimately what this is about. Not cancellation, not bankruptcy, not a company in crisis in the financial sense. A show that is being run safely in a moment that calls for something more. A man whose best work has always been driven by the hunger that comes from having something to prove, who right now, surrounded by financial security, quarterly records, and a company that doesn't need him to be exceptional in order to be successful, may simply have run out of things to prove. And the audience feels that, not consciously, not in a way that most of them would be able to articulate if you asked them on their way out of an arena, but in the aggregate quiet of the weekly numbers settling where they settle. In the absence of water-cooler conversations about what happened on Raw last night, in the slight but persistent sense that the show is happening rather than building, arriving, rather than going somewhere. That's what the ratings plateau is measuring. That's what the creative criticism is pointing at. That's the thing that the quarterly filings cannot see, and that no amount of Netflix top 10 chart placements can disguise. Raw is a show that is profitable enough to run forever, exactly as it is. That's the most dangerous thing about it right now, because a show that doesn't have to get better, that can survive indefinitely on the strength of contracts already signed, and audiences already conditioned, will always find a reason not to. The incentive to improve has to come from somewhere outside the numbers. It has to come from the person with the authority to make something worth watching, choosing to care whether it's worth watching or not. Triple H built something at NXT because he had to. He took over Raw at a moment when the product needed saving, and he saved it. Brilliantly, undeniably, in ways that produced some of the best wrestling television in years. Now he's in the hardest phase of any creative leader's tenure, the phase where the crisis is over. The machine is running, the money is coming in, and the only thing still at stake is the quality of the work itself. Nobody is going to fire him over the weekly numbers. Nobody is going to pull the Netflix deal because the creative team is playing it safe. The external pressure that once kept this industry honest isn't there anymore. There's only the internal pressure, the standard he holds himself to. The question of whether being the man who runs the most profitable wrestling show in history is enough, or whether he wants to be the man who runs the best one. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer yet. The 2026 Raw product, heading into Night of Champions and beyond, still carries all of the same pressures and all of the same potential. Braun Breaker is getting his shot. The women's division has talent ready to headline. The mid-card has people positioned to break through if the booking gives them the runway. The Netflix platform is still reaching an audience that cable never could. The tools haven't changed. The question is still the same one it's been since the WrestleMania 40 peak. Who decides to be great? The version of Triple H who built NXT's black and gold era, who orchestrated the completion of Cody Rhodes' story, who brought CM Punk back into a moment that lit up arenas. That version answers the question by getting to work, by pushing the buttons that need pushing, by building the stars the show needs built, by making Raw a show that people feel they have to watch, rather than a show people are comfortable skipping and catching up with later. That version of Paul Levesque is still in the building. The show is waiting for him to show up.